morning, Catherine. Catherine is here with us at the ASN Europe conference in Graz. Catherine comes to us from the University of Hull, and she presented yesterday in front of a packed audience her new book, Race and the Yugoslav Region, Post-Socialist, Post-Conflict and Post-Colonial. The laudits were coming thick and fast yesterday, but I would like to give you the chance to tell our viewers a little bit about your motivations to write this book, and then also to give us a brief overview or synopsis of the main arguments.
Thank you, Dario. Okay, I think I started writing this book because I realised I needed it to have existed when I was doing my own PhD. So my PhD was on popular music and national identity in Croatia since the breakup of Yugoslavia. And I realised that I had been able to write a lot about ethnicity and the symbolic construction of that. I'd been able to write a lot about Balkanism and this adaptation of Orientalism, which had been happening in the Southeast European studies literature. And yet I had managed to write an entire PhD, then an entire book about popular music, of all things, hardly engaging at all with race. And I was, by the time I realised that, no longer satisfied with that. I'll say a bit more about why I wasn't satisfied with that. But the book really started with a list of questions that I started writing on the back of a conference programme about 5 years ago. And the way that happened, I think, kind of explains the way the book's been written, with one foot in Southeast European studies and one foot in feminist and post-colonial international relations, which isn't primarily concerned with any particular area, but where knowledge grounded in particular areas really is or should be the foundation of a lot of theory. So I really started writing these questions without even knowing that I was going to be, or feeling confident that I could be, somebody who was going to be able to answer them. And I was in the back of a workshop on gender and citizenship in Southeast Europe, in Edinburgh, organised by the Citizenship in Southeast Europe project. I'd just got back from another conference organised by the International Feminist Journal of Politics, and I'd been surrounded there by post-colonial and intersectional feminist research, which was not letting the study of topics like peacekeeping, for instance, which I'd also researched, get away without thinking about race as a global structure of power. I was also realising, largely because of what were then experiences outside work, reading the work of feminists of colour like Flavia Jordan, that some of the ideas we're so used to in Southeast European studies like Europe or modernity, every postgraduate learns about those and talks about those, appear very differently from the point of view of critical race theory. So if Frantz Fanon argues that the opulence of Europe has been founded on slavery, does that include the opulence of Habsburg Rijeka or Venetian split, of independent Ragusa or Ottoman Sarajevo? You know, these were in states and empires which weren't engaged in the Atlantic slave trade, from which Britain and other Western European countries gained so much wealth. So where then is or was the Yugoslav region in the global formations of race, which it was becoming academically and politically more and more important for me to account for? And then why had it been such a confusing question? Moreover, why hadn't my home discipline, Southeast European Studies, been pushing me to think about that in the same way that it would have been impossible to have done my PhD without thinking about Balkanism? And that itself was the product of applying post-colonial theory to Southeast Europe.
Okay, well, you certainly provided all of us with foods for thought, and plenty, if I may say. Could you just sort of elaborate a little bit sort of on the main findings, or sort of give us a brief overview of, you know, what the gist of your argument is?
Okay, so the main argument of the book really is that the Yugoslav region does exist within the global histories and legacies of race which have circulated across the rest of the world. There is enough evidence in the history and the sociology of race and racism to show that, you know, many other regions which are beyond the the main ones where race and racism have been most studied, are still part of those processes. And why then should the Yugoslav region be the only one, in essence, which is outside it? It does not have to have been involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It does not have to have had its own overseas empire. It does not have to have witnessed mass post-colonial migration from the global south in order to be part of that framework. And the kind of evidence which I think we can see by juxtaposing the different kinds of topics I bring together in the book, I think make the case that the Yugoslav region is within the global politics of race. So I start with popular music, and that's partly because my own research started with that, but also because I think it's really in these kinds of everyday and ephemeral cultural artifacts that we so often find representations and narratives of self and other made explicit. And, you know, in essence, I was able to argue that in my first book in terms of ethnicity and Balkanism. We can also do it with race. And I draw on the work of a Black Dutch feminist, Gloria Wekker, who uses a lot of cultural evidence to argue against the kind of racial exceptionalism that she finds in the Netherlands, for instance. So I look at things like stereotypes of Africa and blackness in things like Croatian dance music from the 1990s, you know, these kinds of exoticisms and fantasies which do reveal a racialised cultural imagination at work, although that's not the only thing that identifications with blackness or African American experience have done in popular music from the region. But if popular music then shows that race does matter for understanding the region, I think it's hard to say that it doesn't with some of that evidence. It's therefore not outside global formations of race as it's often seemed to be. So then the other chapters ask, well, what might we be able to perceive in topics we're already familiar with in Southeast European studies, and again, which I've researched myself, if we brought the global history and politics of race explicitly into the context. So, you know, I talk about histories of ethnicity and migration beyond the migrations which have been so important in telling histories of majoritarian ethnicity, including how have migrants from the region confronted formations of race and whiteness in the places they've settled in the past and present. It looks at the different racial formations which have had an impact in the Yugoslav region, including Venetian and German-speaking ones, which created racialised cultural imaginations before post-socialism. I look then at how did state socialism and non-alignment deal or not deal with the question of where Yugoslavia belonged in the racialised geopolitics of the world. And this in particular was where new research kept appearing as I was writing the book. So, you know, I was last in Graz in September 2016 for the Rethinking Yugoslav Internationalism's conference, and race turned out to be one of the most important topics there. Finally, I go back to post-socialism and questions of international intervention and borders and security. All of those are racialised, and, you know, I was planning on writing the book as the refugee crisis was really manifesting in the Western Balkans in 2015, 2016. This is a refugee crisis produced by the racialised EU border and asylum policies, not by ethno-political conflict within the region. So where then does the Yugoslav region and the people who have lived in it and moved through it belong? Why should the Yugoslav region be the only part of the world outside the global politics of race? And I think with this book and the work that this book responds to, we can conclusively say that it isn't. It is within those politics and it has always been part of them.
I can only say wow, and I've read the book, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, it gave me a lot to think about, and I think you've set sort of something in motion here that will make many of us rethink our own work. So on that, I have to congratulate you once again. Thank you for finding the time to do this interview. I hope you've enjoyed your stay in Graz thus far, and you'll enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope to welcome you in Graz anytime soon.
Thank you.